In this episode, the world that believed war was impossible, the alliance system that made it inevitable, the arms race nobody could stop, and the summer of 1914 that changed everything. Tales from 2070, let's go.
This documentary is narrated from 2070, with strict political neutrality, with the sole purpose of describing history facts and future extrapolation and fiction. No positions are taken. All visuals are AI generated. Full statement in the channel description. Imagine a world that believed, with complete sincerity, that it had solved the problem of war, not abolished it, not made it physically impossible, but rendered it so irrational, so economically self-defeating, so structurally unthinkable, that any leader seriously contemplating it would be dismissed as a fool or a madman. Imagine a world where the smartest, most educated, most influential people, the economists, the diplomats, the journalists, the philosophers, had constructed a compelling, data-supported argument that major war between the great powers simply would not happen, could not happen, not because human nature had changed, but because the world had changed around it. That world existed. It was called the Belle Époque, the beautiful era, and it lasted, roughly, from the 1880s to the summer of 1914. For about 30 years, the great powers of Europe experienced something unprecedented. A long peace, combined with extraordinary economic growth, combined with a flowering of art, science, medicine, and technology that was genuinely without precedent in human history. And in that peace and that prosperity, a whole civilization convinced itself that the worst was behind it, that the barbarity of previous centuries had been superseded, that rational modern industrial humanity had learned at last to settle its disputes without mass slaughter. From where I stand, from 2070, looking back across more than a century of what humanity did to itself, that confidence is almost unbearable to contemplate. Not because the people who held it were stupid. They were, in many cases, the most rigorous and the most thoughtful people of their generation, but because they were wrong in a way that would cost, before the bill was fully settled, somewhere between 100 and 120 million human lives spread across 2 world wars and the decades of catastrophe between them. And, as you will hear if you stay with this record long enough, the same mistake, in different forms, dressed in different clothes, speaking different languages, would be made again. Let me tell you what the world actually looked like in 1900, not through the lens of what came after, but as it appeared to the people living in it. Because the story of how a prosperous, connected, culturally sophisticated civilization managed to destroy itself is not a story about monsters. It is a story about systems, about the way that structures built for entirely rational reasons can acquire their own logic, a logic that, under the right conditions, runs completely out of human control. Europe in 1900 was, by almost every measurable standard, the most prosperous civilization in recorded history. The nations of Western Europe, Britain, France, Germany, Belgium, the Netherlands, had, over the previous century, undergone an industrial transformation of almost incomprehensible speed and scale. In 1800, most people in Europe still lived and worked as their great-grandparents had, farming, trading locally, largely dependent on horses and wind and muscle for energy and transport. By 1900, they had steam engines, railways, electricity, steel mills, chemical industries, transatlantic cables, motorcars, and the beginnings of aviation. The material conditions of life had been transformed more rapidly than at any point in human history, and they were connected to each other in ways that would not be seen again until the late 20th century. By 1900, undersea telegraph cables linked every major city on Earth. A commercial message from London to New York took minutes rather than weeks. A diplomatic communication from Berlin to St. Petersburg arrived in hours. European investors owned factories in Argentina, rubber plantations in Malaya, railways in India, mines in South Africa. British merchants bought their steel from the Ruhr Valley. French banks financed Russian infrastructure. German chemicals and pharmaceuticals were sold in pharmacies from Chicago to Tokyo. The global economy of 1913, measured as international trade as a proportion of total output, was comparable to, and in some ways exceeded, the globalization of the 1980s and 1990s. People who lived in that era genuinely believed they were witnessing something new under the sun. A world economy so intertwined that the old nationalisms, the old territorial rivalries, the old military competitions had become economically obsolete. This belief had its intellectual champion. In 1910, a British journalist and Member of Parliament named Norman Angell published a book called The Great Illusion. His argument was elegant, carefully reasoned and backed by economic data. The thesis, in brief, modern industrial economies were so intertwined that the financial costs of war, the disruption to trade, the destruction of credit, the collapse of the international payment system would fall as heavily on the victor as on the defeated. War between the great powers had become economically irrational. Any nation that started one would be cutting off its own foot. Therefore, the logic ran, it wouldn't happen. Couldn't happen. Not because anyone was particularly virtuous, but because the incentives all pointed decisively in the other direction. The Great Illusion sold in enormous quantities. It was translated into 11 languages, including German and French and Russian. Norman Angell was praised by politicians, celebrated by peace movements, debated in universities. He would, decades later, win the Nobel Peace Prize. He was, by any measure, a serious and intelligent man, and his argument was not wrong exactly. The economic analysis was largely sound. War was economically irrational. And yet, within 4 years of his book's publication, the most destructive war Europe had ever seen had begun. The world was rational, and it chose catastrophe anyway. The Great Illusion turned out to be, with beautiful historical precision, about something different than its author intended. To understand how that was possible, you need to look underneath the prosperity, because the Belle Époque, that beautiful era, was built on a foundation that contained several very deep cracks, and none of the leaders of Europe were looking at the foundation. They were looking at the gleaming surface. The first crack was structural. It was the system of alliances. Over the previous 40 years, the great powers of Europe had organized themselves into 2 armed camps. On one side, the Triple Alliance, Germany, Austria, Hungary, and Italy. On the other, the Triple Entente, France, Russia, and Britain. Each alliance rested on a straightforward promise. If you are attacked, we will come to your aid. The logic of deterrence. If you know that attacking France means simultaneously fighting Russia and Britain, you will think very carefully before attacking France. And for decades, this logic held. The alliances were, in themselves, not a cause of war. They were designed to prevent it. But here is the problem with deterrence systems built on automatic guarantees. They are automatic. The promise that makes them credible, we will come to your aid without question, is also the promise that makes them dangerous. Because if your ally does something reckless, you are obligated to follow. If your ally is attacked for something it did to provoke the attack, you are still obligated to follow. The alliance system had, over decades of incremental commitment, created a structure in which a conflict between 2 countries, however small, however local, however specific to their circumstances, could automatically become a conflict between 8 or 10 countries, spread across an entire continent, before any single leader had time to think through what they actually wanted. Think of it this way. Imagine you have a room full of people, and every person in the room has made a promise to at least 2 others. If someone pushes you, I will push them back. Harder. Immediately. No questions asked. Now introduce a single shove. 1 person, 1 moment, 1 impulse, and watch what happens. The original dispute, whatever it was, becomes instantly irrelevant. The mechanism takes over. That was the alliance system of Europe in 1914. It had been built, brick by careful brick, to prevent the first shove, and it guaranteed that if the first shove came anyway, the entire room would be fighting before anyone understood why. The second crack ran even deeper, and it ran across the entire surface of the globe. By 1900, the European powers had, between them, formally colonized approximately 84% of the land surface of the Earth outside Europe. The British Empire covered roughly 24% of the globe. France controlled territories in West Africa, North Africa, Indochina, the Pacific. Germany had colonies in East Africa, West Africa, and the Pacific. Belgium, a country that could be crossed by car in 2 hours, administered a territory in Central Africa, the Congo, 77 times its own size. Even Portugal, a small nation on the western edge of Europe that was not, by any serious measure, a great power, controlled Angola, Mozambique, and territories on 3 other continents. This is relevant here, not because the story of colonialism is a sidebar to European history. It is not a sidebar. It is the main story for the majority of humanity in this period. But because the colonial competition was generating constant friction between the great powers, and that friction was heating the system from below, France and Germany came very close to war over Morocco in 1905, and again in 1911. Russia and Britain had been rivals in Central Asia for decades. Austria-Hungary and Russia were in active competition for influence over the crumbling remains of the Ottoman Empire in the Balkans. Every time a colonial dispute arose, it added pressure to a system that was already under stress. And then there was the arms race. Between 1870 and 1914, the military spending of the major European powers increased by multiples. Germany launched a massive naval construction program explicitly designed to challenge British supremacy at sea, the so-called dreadnought race, named after the new class of battleship that made all previous warships obsolete. Britain responded by building more dreadnoughts, faster. France expanded its army. Germany responded by expanding its army further. Russia, alarmed by German rearmament, embarked on a massive military modernization program, which, when German planners noticed it, made them recalculate their timelines and their options. Each move was a rational response to the moves of others. Each response increased the overall level of armament, mutual suspicion, and strategic urgency. By 1914, Europe maintained armies of a size and firepower that had no precedent in human history. There is a pattern here, a pattern I have watched play out in different forms across 170 years of history since this moment that deserves to be named. It is the pattern of competitive preparation. Every actor in the system is behaving rationally by its own logic, building weapons to deter others from using weapons. Every actor is also simultaneously making the system more dangerous. Each individual decision is defensible. The collective outcome is catastrophic. It is, in the language of the economists who would later study it, a collective action problem, a situation in which individually rational behavior produces collectively disastrous results. And it is, I'm sorry to say, a problem that the species I'm describing has never definitively solved. But perhaps the most dangerous crack was not structural. It was not visible on maps or in arms budgets. It was cultural. It lived in the minds of the people who would make the decisions, and in the minds of the millions who would follow those decisions into the trenches. It was what the educated, powerful, socially dominant people of the early 20th century believed about war itself. And to understand that belief, you first have to understand a word that sounds academic but describes something deeply practical. The word is nationalism, not patriotism, the ordinary human affection for the place you come from, the language you speak, the customs you grew up with. Those things are ancient and largely harmless. Nationalism in the specific form it took in 19th century Europe was something more systematic and more dangerous. the doctrine that the world should be organized into sovereign nation-states, that each nation had a natural, inalienable right to self-governance, and, crucially, that the greatness of a nation could be measured, demonstrated, and defended through competition with other nations. Competition for territory, for trade, for military prestige, for colonial possession, for cultural influence. Nationalism, in this form, was the operating system on which every other crack in the European system ran. Every great power in Europe was, by 1914, a nationalist project. Germany had only been unified as a single state since 1871, a very recent creation, still asserting its identity, still competing for the international respect it felt its size and economic power deserved. France had never forgiven Germany for the humiliation of the Franco-Prussian War, for the siege of Paris, for the German army parading through the streets of the French capital, for the annexation of Alsace and Lorraine. That wound was 40 years old in 1914. It had not healed. Austria-Hungary was a multi-ethnic empire trying to hold together a dozen nationalities: Austrians, Hungarians, Czechs, Slovaks, Poles, Croats, Slovens, Bosnians, Italians, through a combination of administrative complexity and the quiet threat of force. The empire was not a nation, it was a structure, and structures, unlike nations, cannot inspire the kind of loyalty that makes men willing to die. The mass press played a role here that it is impossible to overstate. By 1900, cheap, high-speed printing technology had made newspapers available to virtually every literate adult in Europe, and literacy rates had risen dramatically over the previous 50 years, precisely because governments had understood that an educated workforce was economically productive. The result was a new kind of public sphere in which millions of people were reading, simultaneously, the same stories about the same events, filtered through the same national lens. Newspapers in Germany emphasized German grievances. Newspapers in France emphasized French humiliations. Newspapers in Britain amplified fears about German naval power. Each national press reinforced and amplified the particular anxieties of its own audience, and the audience in turn created political pressure on governments. Pressure to be firm, to be strong, to not back down, to not appear weak in front of the National Gallery. In this way, the mass press functioned as an accelerant. It did not create the tensions, but it made them burn hotter and faster. The dominant intellectual framework was what historians now call social Darwinism. The name comes from Charles Darwin, but Darwin himself bore very little responsibility for what was done in his name. He was a biologist who had described how species evolve through natural selection. His followers, misunderstanding or misapplying his work with what seems in retrospect like deliberate enthusiasm, had taken his description of biological processes and turned it into a prescription for national policy. The argument, competition between nations, between peoples, between races, was natural, inevitable, and ultimately progressive. The strong would prevail. The weak would yield. War was not a catastrophe. It was a test of national vitality. It was, in the language actually used at the time, cleansing, purifying, an opportunity for a nation to prove, on the field of battle, its right to exist. This was not a fringe position. It was not the view of cranks or extremists. It was taught in the elite universities of Germany, France, and Britain. It was the animating philosophy of much of the military and political leadership of Europe. The German military theorist Friedrich von Bernhardi published Germany and the Next War in 1912. He argued not merely that war was inevitable, but that it was biologically necessary, that a nation which failed to assert itself through military power was committing biological suicide. The book was a bestseller. It was treated as serious strategic analysis. It was read by politicians and generals across Europe. When von Bernhardi said these things, serious people nodded. This intellectual climate is the context in which the decisions of 1914 were made. And underneath the ideology was a simpler, more human problem. Most of the men who would make the decisions in 1914 had never seen a modern industrial war. The last major European conflict, the Franco-Prussian War of 1870 to 1871, had been brief, decisive, and fought with weapons that were now 40 years out of date. The American Civil War of the 1860s had offered a preview of what industrialized mass warfare would look like. The trenches, the attrition, the appalling casualties from rapid-fire weapons. But European military planners had largely ignored its lessons. They were planning for a short war, a decisive war, a war of movement and maneuver, over in weeks, the armies home by Christmas. Nobody, or almost nobody, had fully understood what the combination of machine guns, modern artillery, barbed wire, and conscript armies of millions of men would actually produce when they met each other in a fixed line across hundreds of kilometers of northern France. Here is a number that the generals of 1914 had available to them but did not fully absorb. A single Maxim machine gun could fire approximately 450 rounds per minute. A single gun, operated by a crew of 4, could produce the same rate of fire as roughly 80 riflemen. The British Army alone had brought machine guns to the Boer War in South Africa and had observed their effect in detail. The lessons were written up in reports, the reports were filed, and the war plans of 1914 were still built on the assumption that infantry could cross open ground in reasonable safety, that cavalry would have a decisive role, that wars were won by the offensive, and that the character of the soldier mattered more than the technology he faced. There is a kind of institutional blindness. I have watched it appear in different forms across 170 years of history that occurs when a system's self-image cannot accommodate the implications of the facts it already possesses. The facts about machine guns were not secret. They were not suppressed. They were sitting in reports on desks in every major war ministry in Europe. But the mental model that organized those facts, the model of war as a contest of national will, of heroic offensive action, of short, decisive campaigns, could not accommodate what the facts actually implied, and so the facts were noted and then essentially set aside. The mental model was preserved, and millions of men would pay the price of that preservation in the mud of Flanders. One more thing deserves to be said about the technology of 1914, because it is relevant not only to what happened then, but to patterns that will recur throughout this account. The same communications revolution that had made the world economically interconnected had also made crises move faster. A telegram could cross Europe in hours. A mobilization order could be transmitted to every corner of an empire almost simultaneously. But the speed of communication had not been matched by the speed of diplomacy, or the speed of human judgment, or the speed of the political processes that might, in theory, have been able to stop what was coming. In 1914, a crisis that might, in an earlier century, have taken weeks or months to escalate, giving time for second thoughts, for back-channel negotiations, for the slow cooling of tempers, would unfold in days. The technology had, inadvertently, removed the time that diplomacy needed. I want to stop here and say something that the tragic weight of what comes next can sometimes obscure. The people living in Europe in 1900 were not sleepwalkers because they were stupid, or because they were callous, or because they secretly wanted to die. They were ordinary human beings, farmers and shopkeepers and students and factory workers and mothers and fathers, trying to live their lives in the world as it presented itself to them. The world presented itself as prosperous, as connected, as moving, slowly but visibly, in the direction of progress. They had no way of knowing what the structure beneath them was actually building toward. The farmer in Bavaria did not want war. The shop assistant in Bordeaux did not want war. The engineering student in Vienna, who was preparing his university examinations in the summer of 1914, did not want war. What they wanted is what every human being in every century has wanted: safety, meaning, a life that held together. The tragedy of 1914 is not that the people who lived through it were especially wicked or especially foolish. The tragedy is that they were ordinary human beings trapped inside extraordinary systems. Systems that had their own momentum, their own logic, their own appetite. And when those systems finally moved, the ordinary human beings could do very little to stop them. This is something I've thought about often, standing in 2070, looking back. The lesson of 1914 is not that people were warmongers. The lesson is this: you do not need to want war for war to happen. You only need to build the system that makes it inevitable and then wait for a trigger. And the trigger, when it came, was not some vast geopolitical movement. It was a 19-year-old with a gun on a street corner in a provincial Balkan city. The gap between the scale of the trigger and the scale of the catastrophe is so vast that it still produces a kind of vertigo, even now, more than 150 years later. By 1912, the machinery was under acute stress. The focal point was the Balkans, that complex, volatile region in southeastern Europe where the Ottoman Empire, which had dominated the area for 5 centuries, was finally, visibly, collapsing. The Ottoman retreat was creating a power vacuum, and into that vacuum multiple competing forces were rushing simultaneously. Serbia, newly confident after its success in the Balkan Wars of 1912 and 1913. Austria-Hungary, desperately anxious to prevent a large, nationally ambitious South Slavic state on its southern border. Russia, which saw itself as the protector of the Slavic peoples and had its own strategic interests in access to the Mediterranean, and Germany, which had its own reasons for supporting Austria-Hungary and its own anxieties about Russian expansion. The 2 Balkan Wars, the first in 1912, the second in 1913, had changed the map of southeastern Europe significantly without resolving any of the underlying tensions. Serbia had emerged from the wars much enlarged, much more confident, and much more committed to the idea of a greater Serbia that would unite all the South Slavic peoples, including millions who currently lived inside Austria-Hungary. For Vienna, this was an existential threat. A large Russian-backed Serbian state on its southern border, actively encouraging its own South Slavic subjects to break away, was not a problem to be managed indefinitely. It was a problem that had to be solved. The question, in the chancelleries of Vienna and Berlin, was not whether to confront Serbia. It was when. In Berlin, the military planning had been underway for years. The Schlieffen Plan, named after the former chief of the German General Staff, Count Alfred von Schlieffen, was a detailed operational blueprint for fighting a 2-front war. The core problem for Germany was geography. France to the west, Russia to the east. The plan's solution was audacious. Attack France first, through neutral Belgium, with overwhelming force, knock France out of the war in 6 weeks, then turn east and deal with Russia, which, being vast and slow to mobilize, would not be ready to fight in earnest for at least 2 months. It was a plan that depended on precise timing, on rapid movement, on every element working exactly as designed. It was a plan that left almost no room for diplomacy once it was set in motion. And it was the plan that Germany's military leadership had spent 15 years refining, and which they were, by 1914, psychologically committed to using. France had its own plan, Plan 17, built on the romantic assumption that the offensive spirit of the French soldier, the famous élan, could overcome German material advantage. Russia had mobilization timetables calculated to the hour. Britain had commitments, some formal and some informal, that its political leaders had not fully disclosed to their own parliaments. Every great power had a war plan. Every war plan was built on assumptions about what the others would do. And every war plan, once activated, made every other war plan more urgent. The system was, by 1914, a fully loaded gun with a hair trigger, pointed in every direction simultaneously. In the last weeks before the war, the telegraph offices of Europe processed an unprecedented volume of traffic. Ultimatums, replies, counter-proposals, military orders, diplomatic protests, private appeals, public declarations. The Austrian ultimatum to Serbia, delivered on July 23, 1914, gave Serbia exactly 48 hours to respond. The ultimatum was, as the British Foreign Secretary Edward Grey said at the time, the most formidable document he had ever seen addressed by one state to another. Serbia accepted almost all of its terms. Austria-Hungary declared war anyway. Within a week, the system activated. Russia mobilized. Germany declared war on Russia and France. German troops crossed into Belgium. Britain declared war on Germany. 8 countries at war in 7 days. Not one of their governments had sat down and chosen this outcome. They had all, in different ways, in different moments, made choices that made it inevitable. Let me tell you about what was being built in that same world. Because the Belle Époque was not only a time of gathering catastrophe, it was also, genuinely, measurably, astonishingly, one of the most creative periods in human history. And the same civilization that was loading the gun was also producing something that it would not fully appreciate until much of it had been destroyed. In Vienna, Sigmund Freud was developing psychoanalysis, a completely new framework for understanding the human mind. In Paris, Pablo Picasso and Georges Braque were dismantling and rebuilding the visual language of painting, inventing cubism, a mode of seeing that would permanently change what art could do. In London, H.G. Wells was writing science fiction that would, within decades, prove prophetic in its accuracy about submarine warfare, aerial bombing, and the power of organized propaganda. In Germany, Max Planck was publishing the work that would become quantum mechanics, the theory that would eventually make possible everything from transistors to nuclear reactors to the technology I am using to speak to you now, 150 years later. Albert Einstein, in 1905, had published his special theory of relativity, a paper that rewrote the laws of physics as they had been understood since Newton. Marie Curie, the first person to win the Nobel Prize in 2 separate scientific disciplines, was in Paris, continuing her research into radioactivity that would lead, in time, to both cancer treatment and the atomic bomb. In America, Orville and Wilbur Wright had made the first powered flight in 1903, and by 1908 their machines were already flying for more than an hour at a time. The rate of discovery, of genuine, world-changing discovery, was accelerating faster than at any previous point in human history. This is the paradox that I keep returning to, looking back from 2070. The same civilization that was producing the most extraordinary flowering of human creativity in recorded history was simultaneously producing the industrial infrastructure of mass death. The same factories that made bicycles also made artillery shells. The same chemical industry that made fertilizer also made poison gas. The same logistics systems that moved food and goods across continents would, within years, be moving armies and ammunition. The creative and the destructive were not opposed. They were the same force, channeled in different directions by different political choices. I want to give you a sense of the scale of what was at stake, of what the people living in 1913 stood to lose, and did not yet know they were about to lose. The global economy of 1913 was, as I mentioned, remarkably integrated. But the figures only tell part of the story. What they describe, underneath the numbers, is a web of human relationships, commercial, professional, intellectual, personal, that crossed every national border in Europe. British scientists corresponded with German colleagues. French artists exhibited in Berlin. German musicians performed in London. Academic journals published simultaneously in multiple languages. International congresses on medicine, on science, on law, on peace, met regularly in European cities, bringing together people from countries that would, within 2 years, be trying to kill each other. The physicist Ernest Rutherford, working in Britain on the structure of the atom, was in regular correspondence with colleagues in Germany who were working on the same problems. The irony, which would not become fully apparent until 1945, is that the physics being developed in those international, collaborative, pre-war years would eventually provide the scientific basis for the atomic bomb. The economist John Maynard Keynes, who would later become one of the most influential economic thinkers of the entire 20th century, described the world before the war with a kind of awed, retrospective grief. He wrote of a man who could, before breakfast, invest his money in any corner of the globe, order from any producer on earth, and regard this state of affairs as normal, permanent, and certain, beyond question, beyond threat, beyond serious risk of interruption. Beyond question. Those two words contain the entire flaw, the very certainty that the system produced, the feeling of permanence, of structure, of something too large and too useful and too rational to break, was the thing that made people stop looking at the cracks. Before this chapter closes, I want to return to something I said near the beginning. The people of the Belle Époque were not wrong to value what they had. They were not wrong to believe in the power of commerce and connection and culture to create conditions that made conflict less likely. These things are genuinely true. They genuinely matter. The interconnection of 1913 was a real restraint on conflict. The economists who said that war was economically irrational were, in their economics, correct. The problem was that they had made an error that is easy to make and very difficult to correct. They had built a model of how rational beings ought to behave, and then assumed that their model described how human beings actually do behave. They had correctly identified the economic incentives pointing toward peace, and then concluded that those incentives would be decisive. What they had underweighted, or in some cases simply ignored, was the enormous catalogue of things that make human beings behave in economically irrational ways: pride, fear, tribal loyalty, the pressure of domestic politics, the weight of historical grievance, the logic of systems that have developed their own momentum independent of the intentions of any individual within them. The great mistake of the Belle Époque was not optimism. Optimism is a tool. The mistake was certainty. The certainty that the system was stable. The certainty that the incentives would hold. The certainty that rational calculation would prevail over every other force in human psychology. It is a mistake, and here I speak from the perspective of 2070, which has seen this mistake made several more times, that tends to be made precisely when things are going well, when the evidence all points in the same direction, when doubt feels not just unnecessary, but somehow disloyal to the progress that has been achieved. The times when everything seems fine are, historically, the times that most require vigilance. And vigilance is very difficult to maintain when nothing appears to be wrong. The Austro-Hungarian foreign minister in 1914 was a cultivated man who spoke several languages, collected art, and had served his country as a diplomat in Paris and St. Petersburg. He was not a warmonger. He was not stupid. He was, in many ways, a reasonable representative of his class and his time, a man formed by a world that had not yet shown him what he was capable of setting in motion. After the war, after everything, he would spend the rest of his life in quiet retirement in Austria, apparently carrying the weight of what had happened, but by then the weight was beside the point. The system had run. The dead were dead. The old world was gone. This record is full of men like him, men who were not, individually, villains, men who made choices that seemed, at the moment they were made, defensible within the logic of the world they inhabited, men who were operating inside systems they had not designed and whose full implications they did not understand, and men who collectively produced outcomes that none of them, individually, had chosen or wanted. It is the most persistent and the most frightening lesson of the period I am about to describe. Not that evil men do evil things, that can be guarded against, but that ordinary men, embedded in sufficient systems, with sufficient pressures and sufficient pride, can produce catastrophic outcomes without any individual among them ever making a clear decision to cause a catastrophe. By the summer of 1914, the system was coiled. The alliances were set. The war plans were written. The armies were the largest and most heavily armed in European history. The military timetables, once activated, would run almost automatically, leaving almost no room for second thoughts, for negotiation, for the simple human desire to step back from the edge before it was too late. And in Sarajevo, a city most Europeans would have struggled to locate on a map, a young man was making his own plans. He was 19 years old. His name was Gavrilo Princip. He was a Bosnian Serb nationalist, consumed by a cause that meant almost nothing outside the Balkans, but that was about to mean everything to the world. He had, on the morning of June 28, 1914, positioned himself on a street corner with a pistol and a cause and the bad luck to find himself in the right place at the wrong moment in history. Two shots on an ordinary Sunday morning in a provincial capital that is now the subject of more history books than almost any other city of its size on Earth. Two shots that activated a system 40 years in the making. Two shots that, within 6 weeks, had drawn 8 countries into a war that none of them had specifically wanted and none of them was able to stop. The gap between the trigger and the catastrophe. 2 shots, 1 man, 1 corner, versus the deaths of somewhere between 17 and 22 million human beings, is so vast that it still produces a kind of vertigo, even now, from the distance of 2070. I will end this chapter with a thought that I find myself returning to often. In the summer of 1913, exactly 1 year before the war began, there were alive in Europe several young men who would, within decades, shape the history of the entire world. A failed Austrian art student living in a men's hostel in Vienna, painting postcards to survive. A Serbian student in Sarajevo, planning something that no one but his small circle knew about. A Georgian revolutionary in Siberian exile, filing papers under a name no one remembered. A Bolshevik intellectual in Zurich, writing pamphlets that almost no one was reading. None of them, in the summer of 1913, had yet done what history would remember them for. The century that would define everything that followed was not yet underway. It was about to begin. In the next chapter, we follow those 2 shots. From the moment they were fired on a Sunday morning in Sarajevo, through 6 weeks of ultimatums, mobilizations, and cascading declarations of war, to the moment in early August 1914, when the system that Europe had been building for 40 years finally activated, completely and irreversibly, and the world that had existed before those shots ceased to exist. The chapter is called The Trigger, and it begins, as all catastrophes ultimately begin, not with madness, but with a plan that everyone agreed was perfectly reasonable.
Tales from 2070 is one of the most ambitious history projects on YouTube. 170 years of human conflict told from the only perspective that can see the whole picture, the future. If that's the kind of story you want to follow, hit like, subscribe, and ring the bell. And don't miss the next episode, only on Tales from 2070.